Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Sean O'Connor. If you're a fan of haibun, you'll know Sean and the haibun journal he was founding editor of, called quite simply the Haibun Journal. If you don't know it, I'll put a link in the show notes. Do go and explore. Now, Sean has done a lot of things with his life so far, but you know what? I'll put a link to his website in the show notes and you can go and have a read and see the cutest little photo of the young Sean during his first year at school and find out all about him. But before I hand over to Sean, I'll just say this won't be the last you'll hear of him. He's going to be appearing on Poetry P Readings in its second series next year, when he's going to read to us from his recent book, Fragmentation, a winner of the HSA Merit Book Award for Best Haibun Book. Again, link in the show notes if you'd like to have a read. And of course, send me questions for Sean based on the book. He's also going to do another bonus podcast with myself and Shane Pruitt, the haibun editor here at P Towers. He's on this recording too, but you won't hear from him in this edition. You'll hear from him in the bonus episode, because we're going to be asking Sean questions, some of which you've sent us. Thank you very much. So Sean, I'm handing over to you and I'll see you at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. We've been talking about this for a while and finally we get to sit down in front of cameras and do this. So I'm really honored as the editor and the founder of the Haibun Journal to talk to you today about the haibun form. And of course, I can't talk about haibun unless I talk about haiku. So I'll be talking about both. So I'm basically got 4 sections here that I'm going to do, and I will put some notes on the screen as we go along so that you can freeze that and take them down or grab them or whatever. Anyway, here we go. The first thing I'd like to talk, or I'll be talking in the following sequence, which is the nomenclature, the language of haibun and haiku and what those words mean specifically. And I think that's important to get our heads around that. Then I'm going to talk about how haibun evolved, and then I'll move from there about writing haiku, which will be actually something I'll spend less time on, because I think the key objective I have is to give people a sense of the origins, the development of the haibun form and what the form is and what the words that we use around, including the word haibun, what does all of this mean? So I'm going to go through my own notes, which I'll then put up gradually as I go along. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is the kind of history of this Japanese literature, because it's from the context of what happened before haiku and haibun that we begin to get an appreciation for what they are. How did they come to be? How did they come into being is really what I want to talk about. So there's some of the nomenclature I need to talk about. Is the first thing I want to talk about is the word uta. Uta means poem or poems. Now here's a trick that you need to know with Japanese. I lived in Japan for 5 years. I speak Japanese. I'm married to a Japanese person, etc., etc. And the Japanese language is very rich and it's very interesting, but there's a twist, a very big difference with English. One of them is they don't distinguish between single and plural. So every word, every noun can be singular or plural. You say the cat, there's no that. It's either cat can mean 1 cat or 10 cats. Does that make sense? So neko, cat, is one or many. So it trips people up a little bit, that. So when we say haiku, it can mean 100 haiku or 1 haiku, a little bit like the way we use the word euro. We don't say 10 euros, we say 10 euro and 1 euro, that type of thing. So uta means 2 things at the same time, but not necessarily in the way it's often understood in the West. Uta means a poem or poems, but it also means song or songs. But that doesn't mean a particular poem is a song or a song is a poem. So it's the context that drives it. So I'm a musician, and when I was in Japan, people would say, what kind of songs do you sing? I would say Airlando no uta, Irish songs. But they didn't understand that maybe I'm reading poetry from Ireland. The context is important. So in that case, uta means song. If they said to me, what kind of poetry do you write? And if my answer was Irish poems, then I would say Airlando no uta, exactly the same thing. But they don't get confused about that. Now, occasionally, some poems are sung, but generally not. That's also the same in English anyway. And there's little suffixes that go on the end of words that mean uta or poem or song, and they are ka and she. So you hear of tanka or tan shi. in the beginning, the first Japanese poetry was what we call the tanka. And I say we call the tanka these days because tanka was originally and still is called a waka. So I'd like to talk about this word waka. I've seen it mistranslated many times. Recently I saw an academic mistranslated as short song. It's not really accurate at all. So the word waka is in two parts, wa and ka. And I've already said ka indicates it's a poem or a song, but in this case, a poem. So what does wa mean? Well, surprisingly, the name of Japan at the time, hundreds of years ago, when waka were first written, then the country itself was called wa, simply wa. And wa at that time meant Japan. And it also has the same wa also at that time and today means harmony. So this is a culture that decided to call their country harmony. And that's because culturally, harmony is quite critical and central to their cultural thinking. So harmony with what? Well, the first thing is harmony among people. And the second is people being in harmony with the world, or as we would say, with nature. This goes back deep in the roots of Shintoism in Japan and so on. So the waka then is translated as Japanese poem. That's what it means. Why would they distinguish between a Japanese poem as opposed to other forms of poetry? The answer is simple. Up to that point, all their poetry was written in Chinese. And the word for Chinese in this case is kan. And as I've said, shi can also mean poem. So kanshi means Chinese poetry. Now, the tradition of writing poetry in Chinese, and classical Chinese more to the point, is still carried on today. I actually know people who write, Japanese people who go to their classes every week on kanji writing, and they learn very ancient classical Chinese in order to write poems in that language. And they still do it today. It's still very common, actually. So you will often hear Chinese poems. So waka meant a poem that was Japanese, literally written in the Japanese language, and they were what we call tanka. Hence the confusion, waka, tanka, that is exactly the same thing. So wa means harmony, waka means Japanese poem, and a waka is the same as a tanka. And the word tan in this case means short. So a tanka is a short poem. Now I'm going to introduce another important word because it's connected to haiku. And that word, that suffix as it were in this case, is ku, Ku. Ku means verse. So a haiku is a verse. Full stop. So it cannot be anything that we wouldn't recognize normally as a verse. It can't be two words in the middle of a page because it's not quite a verse. And it can't be longer than a verse. Verses have their limitations. So we already have a clue here. And in that clue is extended when we look at the structure of a tanka, also known as waka. The tanka consists of two verses. The first verse is 3 lines, typically, well, still to this day, written in 575 syllables. And the name of that verse is the kami no ku, ku meaning verse, and kami meaning, in this case, upper. So it's the upper verse. The lower verse, which is called the shimo no ku, is 2 lines of 7 syllables each. So a tanka then is 2 verses. Although it's written straight as 5 lines, that's not the structure. The internal structure is 2 distinct verses. Anthony, I should say, Markov in Britain recently commented that the 2 verses are the poet sees and the poet reflects. It's a nice way of thinking about tanka. So already we're seeing the word ku appearing in the structure of tanka, the 2 verses. And haiku has the same ku, so we're expecting a verse in that. So the haiku developed as the opening verse of a renga. The renga worked as a gathering of poets together who would in turn write individual verses of a long poem, a sequence, and ren means a sequence. And ga, in this case, is a variation on ka, meaning poem. So it means a sequenced poem. And what they were doing is they were essentially writing a lot of waka, as they would have called it at that time, or tanka, in a row. But they weren't independent of each other. So each verse would go to the next verse. Instead of it wasn't like you write a tanka and then I'll write another one. It was you write the first verse, the kami no ku. Someone else would add the next two lines, the shima no ku. And then from there, they would create another section of the poem into the next kami no ku, the next 3-line verse, into the next 2-line verse, and on they go. And the opening verse was the only verse that had no restrictions on it in the same way as the rest of the verses. So what do I mean by restrictions? Well, we often hear people talk about link and shift, and that in the haibun, there's this phenomenon of linking and shifting between the prose and the haiku. This is something that's been imported by Westerners as an idea into haibun, and I have no evidence that that's ever been the case in Japan. And I don't think of haibun as structured like that. And there's a simple reason. Because the link and the shift in a renga is predetermined in the following way. So the opening verse has no demand for the link and shift. It's obviously the next verse that does. And each of the verses, and they'd write typically 36, or they'd write certain numbers in advance. They'd know how many verses they're going to write, and it's predetermined. And the master, the head poet who wrote the opening verse, would then remind the poets that when we get to verse, say 7, I'm just going off the top of my head there, but every verse had some shift predetermined. And the shift might be, you must now name an animal, or you must now include something to say it's autumn, or you must now do something else. But they were predetermined before the poets sit down. So let's say I'm after writing a verse and you're next, and you're sitting there, and then the renga master will say to you, right, you've now got to write the next verse. It's going to be a 3-liner as opposed to a 2-liner. It's got to be connected to the previous verse, and you've got to mention an animal. Or you've got to do this, or you've got to do that. And they have that written down in advance. So it's not a casual linking and shifting. It's a very deliberate game, if you like, that they're playing, that they know in advance what they're doing. That's why the notion of link and shift does not apply well into the haibun form. But there was a twist to the opening verse. An opening is hatsu and ku is verse. Now, when you say hatsu ku quickly, in Japanese, it comes out as haku, which is the original name of haiku and is still used today interchangeably with the word haiku. So the haku is the same as the haiku. So the opening verse, the poet that wrote the opening verse had a very major demand on them. And that demand was that they had to be in tune with the situation that they were meeting in. The specific poets that were gathered, the circumstances in which they were gathered, both physically and emotionally. And they had to give expression to that, to set the tone of the entire poem. So how did they do that, or why were they doing that? Well, for example, if a group of poets meet and one of their fellow poets had died a month earlier, the mood might not be very uplifting. There might be a sense of a certain forlornness in the group. They know that they're gathering and one of their number has passed away since they last gathered, for example. And the haiku writer would have to kind of capture that. So they would also, the haiku master had to give a sense, the haiku writer had to give a sense of the time of year that this was taking place, because that also changes the emotional tone. So a group of haiku poets, or poets of any kind, sitting in a freezing cold winter, remember, no central heating in those days, and the snow outside or a big storm, the emotional atmosphere is very different to sitting on a beautiful spring evening or in a really hot, humid night. And it's very tropical in Japan in the summer. So the haiku writer would have to reflect all of that, and they only had 3 lines to do it. So they would always refer to the so-called season, but that sometimes is very narrowed down to a particular day. In America, it might be Memorial Day or other days of the year that have emotional resonance. So this business of writing the haiku was reserved for the person in their number that was regarded as the better poet, the most experienced most knowledgeable poet would be assigned the job of writing this haiku, this opening verse, this hatsuku or haiku. And to do that became revered. To do that well was recognized as an incredibly difficult thing to do, a very skillful thing to do. And at one point when Matsuo Basho arrived on the scene of poetry in Japan and literature, he was regarded as one of the finest writers of these opening verses. And he decided that it made sense to him that these verses were so self-contained and so required such poetic skill that it made sense to him that he would try to teach people just to write those independently of the rest of the renga, if you follow what I mean. So he gathered his students around him and he set them out to this task about, can we write haiku that are so good that they stand independently of all other forms, of the rest of the renga or anything else that you can think about? And the answer was, in the end, it was yes, but that was not clear at the time whether that was going to work. So as a consequence of that, his students then applied themselves to really getting haiku writing so well that it would be a form in itself. And that was the birth of the haiku. However, there's a twist. And the twist is that I suppose in some ways they might have lacked a little confidence, but every now and again, I'll take that back. they were confident enough, but it made sense to them that every now and again you might put a little note in front of a haiku, a particular haiku, or after it. And those notes were written for many years, and they might consist of something like, on the death of a child. And then suddenly the haiku takes on a whole new context. Or it might say, a poignant one at the moment would be, written on the day it was announced that the Queen of England passed away. And then you have this haiku. Now, that really gives a whole different dimension to the haiku itself. So before I go any further and get into that, I'll reverse a little bit. I'm going to share screen and allow you to take some notes, or you can have them in the notes, but I'll just put that up and go through that quite quickly with some extra little bits of material. I'm going to share this now. And you can see what I've just been talking about. So here we go. It's uta is a song or poem, depending on the context. Ka or she as suffixes indicate that it's a poem. Kan is Chinese, so kanshi means Chinese poetry, still practiced today in Japan. The waka, which is also the tanka. Waka means harmony, which is the old name for Japan. So therefore, waka means Japanese poem. And the waka is the same as the tanka. And tanka, by the way, means short poem. Ka meaning poem and tan meaning short. 5 lines, 577. Move to the next screen. Ku means verse, and the 2 verses of the tanka are called the kami no ku, the upper verse of 3 lines of 575 syllables. The lower verse is shimo no ku, 2 lines, 77. And we get to haiku, So hatsuku literally means the opening verse of a renga, a long sequence poem, I should say, not a sequence of poems. And the haiku is a kind of a contraction of hatsuku. And today you can use both words to refer to haiku. People often ask me, what's the difference? There's no difference, none at all. In the same way as tanka and waka, there is no difference. Now here's the thing, the hai in haiku means skillful, or in a playful type of way. And when they say playful, those poets writing the renga regarded it as a sort of a series of challenges that they had to go through. So when we say playful, I don't mean like a game of snakes and ladders, which is a pure game of chance. It's playful as in jest. That'd be a better way to think about it. So haiku means a skillful verse. Therefore, we're expecting a lot of skill. And the skill is in the restrictions of the work. The requirement to use kigo very subtly and very well, for example, is a skill. The rhythm in using rhythm in the haiku is a skill. Believe me, that's a particularly difficult skill. So that's where we get to the word haiku, skillful verse. And I move to the next page. In the haiku itself, it's got 3 lines, and they are also named as kami go, meaning upper 5. You see kami no ku in a tanka, the upper verse. Kami go means upper 5, upper. The middle line is 7, naka shichi, and shimo go, lower 5. So now we're thinking of it as something with an upper line, a middle line, and a lower line. So 575 does not simply mean the number of syllables, but it also means that this verse, when read aloud, consists of 3 utterances. And here's why I say it's not only about 575, because we've got the next dimension, which is jiamari, or extended haiku. Jiamari is a word in Japanese, indicates the haiku has more than 17 syllables. And Basho wrote a considerable number of these. In fact, he was arguing that you can write up to 23 syllables, and I've identified 36 of his haiku that are 23 syllables long, and he's written over 1,000 that we know of. Then we've got another word, jitarazu, which means a haiku with less than 17 syllables. This is also important because jitarazu means something missing. So straight away we're thinking, hang on a minute, I thought everything was supposed to be 17 syllables. What's all this jiamari or extended haiku? Well, it means that 575 is the rule of thumb, which has a second meaning, which is that when you read it aloud, it is read as 3 utterances. This changes our entire perspective. It means that anybody who says a haiku is not 17 syllables is blatantly wrong, because 17 syllables is not as relevant as it might appear. A lot of the work may be accidentally 17 syllables. Those who say anything that's not 17 syllables are also wrong, but for a different reason. They're wrong because the Japanese have never adhered to that idea. They've often veered towards more than 17 syllables. So what is it that the Japanese are doing when they're writing haiku? They write and they look for the rhythm of 3 utterances, and then they look at the words they're using and think, can any of these be taken away and not weaken the work? So what we call paring back or tighten. But when they do that, they then regard it as they now have created more space for another word, not necessarily replacing the one they took out. But it's a little bit like writing iambic pentameter when you're writing a sonnet. You need the 5 beats, you write the drafts, you look at a line and you think, oh, I've got a tautology there. I don't need one of those words can go. You take it out, but you don't simply replace it to maintain the rhythm. You then look at the rhythm again and you rewrite the entire line so that you maintain the rhythm. That technique that we use in mainstream, I say mainstream poets, but in poetry that has defined rhythms and meters and so on, is the same technique that the Japanese use in haiku. So the notion that you just pare back and leave it is mistaken. Paring back is brilliant and should be done, but it allows you to find more space. So one of the things that I was always struck by with my haiku friends in Japan, that I used to hear this a lot in Japan, this phrase, this idea, the haiku is already too short. Why would you use even less? Their idea is it's kind of a minimum of 17 syllables, not a maximum, or it's not as short as possible. They say it's already too short. It's too short. It's hard work to make this into a viable poem without making it any shorter. So they're there trying pare back in order to create more space to use other words that will strengthen the poem. That's one of the biggest aspects of haiku writing that really changed my perspective when I went to live in Japan, where I stayed for 5 years in a rural area where nobody spoke English. So this is why the notion of 575 is slightly, has certain risks in it, because we often ignore that it's 3 utterances. What I'm going to do now, off the top of my head, is I'm going to let you hear how that sort of works in Japanese. I'm going to take a little sip of water first. We're all very familiar with Basho's famous frog poem, the poem of the pond and the frog. And I've seen it translated as short as possible. I've seen the shortest translations I've kind of seen roughly go pond, frog, and splash. Just frog, pond, frog, splash. But pond, frog, splash, those 3 words as a representation of that haiku really, really miss the whole feel of it and the rhythm of it. So why don't I say it in Japanese? This is the frog poem in Japanese. Furui keya, kawazu tomikomu, mizu no oto. I'll say that again. Furui keya, kawazu tomikomu, mizu no oto. One statement, a second utterance, a third utterance, a pause at the end of each of the 3 lines. Very clear rhythm, sounds like 3 distinct utterances. Now, the trick is that that is not a unique thing to that poem. All haiku in Japanese have that sound. I've never heard a haiku read aloud in Japanese that doesn't sound like that. So I'll fast forward 100 years or so to Busan. And again, off the top of my head from memory, I'll read one of his more famous haiku, which in English roughly means a rapeseed field, the moon, the moon in the east, the sun in the west, which is regarded as quite a masterpiece by the Japanese. So how does that sound? That sounds like this. Nano hana ya, tsuki wa higashi ni, hi wa nishi ni. I'll say that again. Nano hana ya, tsuki wa higashi ni, hi wa nishi ni. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you take any of the 5-syllable lines and change them with the other poem, if you take those 2 poems and swap the lines around, any of the 5-syllable lines, if you take the middle lines and switch them, they will sound the same rhythm, yet they're written 100 years apart by people who never met each other. Now, in tanka, which has that same structure in the first 3 lines, in other words, that the haiku is like the first verse, the kami no ku of the tanka. Tanka are often sang in Japan, and they have a particular melody. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sing those 2 haiku as if they were the opening lines of tanka, and you'll see why. So I'm going to use the melody they typically use for the opening verses of tanka, which match the haiku rhythm, and I'm going to sing those 2 haiku. So the first haiku is Furui keya, kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. And the second one, Nano hana ya, tsuki wa higashi ni, hi wa nishi ni. You can hear it. Those match quite precisely in the same way as, musicians lock rhythms in for whatever they're playing a bossa nova. They make sure it's in 5/4 rhythm and not 3/4, it's a waltz. So when you hear it like that, you begin to realize that this rhythm of 3 utterances, the second of which is longer than the first 2, and the first and third, and the first and third are very similar. This presents us with a whole other skill set to take on, which is be careful with our penchant or enjambment. When we run one line into another, we can kill that rhythm completely. And I see this with a lot of haiku. We can kill that rhythm. So we have to be very skillful in how we compose our haiku so they have that really strong sense of 3 utterances and that clarity of rhythm. When we go to haibun writing, and you're reading your haibun in front of a live audience or on a radio, the listener should hear the distinction between the prose and the haiku because of the haiku's rhythm. Because there's a switch in the rhythm and the tone and the emotional resonance because of kigo in the haiku. So when the prose by definition does not have fixed rhythm, whereas poetry does. All poetry rhythm is an essential part of all poetry, whereas prose can have what's often is very rhythmic, it's very musical, but it doesn't have to be. And if it is got musicality, it's not consistently musical. You can change the pace and the rhythm, but not with poetry. Once you set up your first verse of any poem, your second verse has to match that rhythm. It won't work if you go chopping and changing rhythms all over the place. And this is what we mean by form when we talk about haiku and haibun. So in that sense, we get a whole different structure. Now, if you look back on the screen, I've left that up there. If you look to the very end, the skill, the high, that means skillful in haiku, is still there with the high one. But the word bun, bun as it's pronounced in Japanese, means sentence or sentences. So just as haiku means a skillful verse, haibun means skillful sentences. So we're expecting sentences. So therefore, we're not expecting a hybrid of one poem followed by a haiku, or a haiku followed by another type of poetry, which seems to be emerging as a trend at the moment. I don't mind what people do, but I'm just trying to tell you the way it works as a form. So in that sense, a haibun is clearly haiku with sentences. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, because when the haiku emerged out of the renga, there tended to be little notes or a little sentence or a half phrase or something put in there to contextualize the piece. Let's look at this book here. This is by Sam Hamill. It's a translation of Isa's, I think he calls it, what does he call it? The Spring of My Life. Yeah, good translation. And it's really, this is one of the great collections of haibun that we will see. But just I draw your attention, and this is in translation. So I draw your attention to the following haiku and the note that Isa, he's talking about other people's haiku, by the way, he's quoting other people. But this is a haiku that's quoted in here by Isa. And in English, the translation Sam Hamill has is, "The cranes cry in vain late into the night. No blanket can thaw this cold world. The cranes cry in vain late into night. No blanket can thaw this cold world." And that's a haiku. But when you read the note beforehand, the note says, "On the night his daughter was buried, Hikaku wrote, 'The cranes cry in vain late into night. No blanket can thaw this cold world.'" Suddenly, that haiku is in a whole different place because of a few words, put one sentence basically put before it. I'll give one more example on that. I'll just read what I'll do this time is I'll read the note followed by the haiku. And again, Isa's quoting someone else and he names them. And it says, "Following the death of his young son, Kagano Chiyo wrote, 'How far has he gone? Where has he wandered? Chasing after dragonflies?'" I'll read the whole thing. "Following the death of his young son, Kagano Chiyo wrote, 'How far has he gone? Where has he wandered? Chasing after dragonflies?'" When you read that on its own, the haiku, it's a haiku and it's good. But when you add that note before it and you realize the poet is talking in the aftermath of their young son's death, it changes our perspective radically. Now, one of the most famous haiku poems by Isa, and I'm going to use Sam's translation, there's a wide range, very hard to translate the rhythm, by the way. So when I'm reading these, I'm not catching the rhythm of the original Japanese. Please bear that in mind. So a very famous piece by Isa is the following. In Sam's translation, "This world of Jew is only the world of Jew. And yet, oh, and yet. This world of Jew is only the world of Jew. And yet, oh, and yet." It's very famous haiku. However, let's read the 3 paragraphs that go before it, written by Isa, which is a haibun when you put the two together. This is quite hard-hitting, I have to say. And I'll go straight into the haiku after it. So I'm reading in translation from Sam Hamill. From Isa. "It is often said that the greatest pleasures result in the greatest misery. But why is it that my little child, who had no chance to savor even half the world's pleasures, who should be green as new needles on the eternal pine. Why should she be found on her deathbed, puffy with blisters raised by the despicable god of smallpox? How can I, her father, stand by and watch her fade away each day like a perfect flower suddenly ravished by rain and mud? 2 or 3 days later, her blisters dried to hard scabs and fell off like dirt softened by melting snow. Encouraged, we made a tiny boat of straw and poured hot sake over it with a prayer and sent it floating downriver in hopes of placating the god of the pox. But our hope and efforts were useless, and she grew weaker day by day. Finally, at midsummer, as the morning glory flowers were closing, her eyes closed forever. Her mother clutched her cold baby and wailed. I knew her heart break, but also knew that tears were useless, that water under the bridge never returns, that scattered flowers are gone forever. And yet nothing I could do could cut the bonds of human love. This world of dew is only the world of dew. And yet, oh, and yet, I need to draw a breath after that. It's difficult to read. I find that particularly emotional to try and read that. So let me talk about at the end about the fact that haibun and haiku then came out of the same period and the same writers who had separated the haku, or that opening verse of the renga, into something independent and unique of it, which they regarded as difficult to write and requiring great poetic skill. They naturally started to add some notes before or after them, sometimes quite casual notes, like say written on the way to visit my brother a year after the death of his wife, for example, or they could be just on holiday in Bermuda. Some of them are just appear anyway to be quite maybe, I won't say trivial, but less emotional impact than the ones I've quoted. But at the same time, Basho himself then went on this famous journey to what's often known as the North Oku, and he wrote this great piece of haibun called The Narrow Road to the Deep North, various translations of that. And what he did was, as he was traveling for months on foot with his companion a lot of the time, and joined by other people here and there, he would write a lot of notes about where he was at what day, a little kind of diary, if you like, a travel diary, but he also wrote an awful lot of haiku as he went along. And afterwards, when he came back, or even as he was going, he would start to put this narrative together, things that happened along this great route, this journey. And he would put haiku in where the haiku he'd already written in among this to, how could I put it? He would put haiku in knowing that he's going to talk about a particular occasion, but the haiku were the primary driver. It was the haiku that were written first. He already had his haiku, and he could rewrite them slightly here and there, but he had the haiku written first, and he had his notes, and then he would look and think, right, okay, I'm going to talk about this event where we met that man saying this or that woman saying that. And he would look at the haiku he'd written around that, and they would be the backbone of what he was going to write. So everything, all the prose was geared constantly to the haiku. Because that's how the haibun developed. It developed out of haiku writing as notes, as explanations, as contextualizations. And that's how they thrive. So, for example, I personally have never written a haibun without first writing haiku that are potential haiku for that haibun. So if I'm going to write a haibun, I don't sit down and start writing the story. I'm going to write about the day my father died, which did happen recently. And if I want to write something poignant or otherwise, whatever it is I'm going to write, I know what I'm intending to write about. But first I sit and I contemplate that whole story, whatever it is. And in doing so, I allow haiku to come to mind, and then I start to write them and work on them. And I usually have quite a few haiku written down before I'm ready then to start telling the story in the haibun form. But I have my haiku already. And I generally don't use them all. I may write 8 haiku that I think would be very useful for this haibun and only use one. And I may use it as the opening. I mean, where it comes and how it works depends on the story I'm telling. So I do not ever start with prose and then try to wonder what haiku would go with that. No, it's the haiku are driving the haibun all the way from the get-go. Start with haiku. You may even write different haiku when you start getting into it and start composing the prose. You may change your mind and all that. But the core method is, it's haiku writing around some story you're working on, followed by the prose that then illuminates that, not the other way around. It's not haiku illuminating prose, it's prose illuminating the haiku. And I will wind up now. I've run out of time, and it's been great talking to you. But as you can see, there's a lot more I'd like to say, but I'll come back to that another time. I hope that's helpful. The last thing I will say, though, is all art is about emotion, and all haibun writing is to deliver emotional resonance and an emotional connection with the reader. That's no different to any other form of literary writing. And we should never lose sight of that. And you can see when I'm even trying to read Issa's account of the death of his 7-year-old, I think she was 7, it's even painful for me to read it aloud today. And I never met Issa. I don't know who he is, apart from that he's a great poet. So I hope that's helpful. The haiku are primary, which is why I spend so much time talking about haiku when I'm talking about haibun. We cannot get away from that. And I'd like to say thank you to Patricia for having me here today, and thank you to Shane, and thank you to all of you for listening, and I hope it was helpful. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. It was a real pleasure to have you on today, talking with real passion about your subject, and of course a lot of knowledge. The idea of the 3 utterances is really stuck in my brain, and the fact that you spoke about the rhythm of the haiku, I think it's going to change the way I write my haiku going forward. So again, thank you very much for coming along today and talking to us. And don't forget, if you'd like to know more about Sean, or you'd like to find out a little bit more about what he's been talking about, particularly the Sam Hamill book, all links will be in the show notes. Do go along and have a look. Thank you very much, Sean. Well, I hope you enjoyed that workshop as much as I did, and are inspired to go out and write some haibun, remembering the importance of the haiku within them. I can hardly wait to close the podcast and settle down with my notebook and do some writing myself. Thanks, Sean. So keep an eye on our submissions info on the website, so you'll know when our next haibun submission period is. Better still, make sure you're signed up to our mailing list, as I'll be sending out reminders using that. Thanks again to Sean, and of course to M. Shane Pruitt, our haibun editor. You can hear from him in the bonus episode that will be published soon. Sean, Shane and I have a right old Q&A session all about haibun. Anyone on the mailing list will hear about this. It won't be on general release. So, see you soon for the next episode of the Haiku Pea. Next time, our original deep haiku and senryu. Till then, keep writing.